In June 1858, the British Parliament, the most powerful government on earth, abandoned its own building. Not because of war, not because of revolution, because the smell coming had become physically impossible to endure. And in doing so, they accidentally solved a problem that had been killing London's poor for 30 years.
You are standing on the north bank of the River Thames. It is June 1858. It is 11 in the morning, and you cannot breathe. What is entering your lungs right now is not fog. It is not industrial smoke. It is not the ordinary smell of a crowded city. What you are breathing, what is coating the inside of your throat, what is making your eyes water, what is causing the person standing 6 feet to your left to press a handkerchief against his face and look away, is the processed biological waste of 2.5 million human beings. All of it. Every cesspit, every drain, every slaughterhouse overflow and brewery discharge and hospital waste pipe in the largest city on Earth. All of it, draining by gravity, by design, by 2 centuries of accumulated civic neglect into the single river running through the heart of London, into the Thames. The river that a generation earlier had been famous for its salmon. The river that the Romans had built their city upon. The river that now, in the summer of 1858, in a heat wave that has driven temperatures to levels not seen in decades, has become something that newspaper reporters are struggling to describe with language available to a family publication. One Times correspondent, writing in the 3rd week of June, tried. He wrote that the smell had become, and this is his phrase, not an exaggeration, a stench of death. Not like death, a stench of death. Because that is what it was. The Thames in the summer of 1858 was not merely unpleasant. It was a biological catastrophe moving slowly through the center of a city that had built its identity around it. The Thames, in the summer of 1858, was not a river. It was an open sewer. And the people suffering most from it were not the people who would ultimately solve it. The people suffering most, the ones dying from cholera in the overcrowded courts and alleys of Southwark and Bermondsey and the East End, had been suffering for 30 years. They had been dying for 30 years. And for 30 years, the people with the power to act had not acted. They had commissioned reports, they had formed committees, they had debated in chambers, and they had done nothing. Because the problem, the cholera, the contaminated water, the open cesspits, the dying poor, had not yet reached their nostrils. It had not yet entered their chambers. It had not yet made them personally, physically, biologically uncomfortable. In June of 1858, it did. And what happened next, in the 12 weeks between the moment Parliament fled its own building and the moment £11 million was approved to fix the problem, is one of the most important and most overlooked stories in the history of the modern world. But to understand why Parliament running from a smell matters, why it changed not just London, but every city on Earth, you need to understand what London actually was in 1858. Not the London of Sherlock Holmes and Victorian elegance and gas-lit drawing rooms that popular culture has constructed. The real London. The London that existed for most of its 2.5 million inhabitants. Because that London, the real one, was something that almost no one with power had ever been willing to look at directly, until they had no choice. London in 1858 was the largest city in the history of human civilization. 2.5 million people, in an area designed for perhaps 300,000. The population of London had tripled in 50 years, not because London had expanded, not because its infrastructure had grown to accommodate the influx, but because the Industrial Revolution had pulled human beings from the countryside into a city that had absolutely no idea what to do with them. There were no sewers, in any meaningful sense. What existed were approximately 200,000 cesspits, brick-lined holes dug beneath the basements and yards of London's houses, into which the waste of the house's inhabitants fell. In theory, these cesspits were emptied regularly by men called night soil men, who came after dark and removed the contents for sale as agricultural fertilizer. In practice, in the overcrowded courts and alleys of the East End and Southwark, where 20 people might share a single outdoor privy above a single overflowing cesspit, the system had collapsed entirely. The cesspits overflowed into the streets. The streets ran into the gutters. The gutters ran into the Thames. The same Thames from which London took its drinking water. The connection between the waste going in and the water coming out, a connection that seems so obvious from this distance that it is almost impossible to believe anyone missed it, was in 1858 not yet understood. Not by the public, not by most physicians, not by the government. What was understood, what had been killing people in enormous numbers for decades, was cholera. The disease appeared without warning in the poorest districts of the city. It killed within hours. A healthy adult could wake in the morning and be dead before evening. The 1849 cholera epidemic killed 14,000 Londoners. The 1854 epidemic killed over 10,000 more. The dead were overwhelmingly poor. They lived in the courts and alleys and overcrowded tenements closest to the contaminated water sources. They had no political representation. They had no access to the committees and debates in which their deaths were occasionally discussed and consistently deferred. And they kept dying. While the committees met, while the reports were commissioned, while the debates continued in a parliament that sat every day of every session beside the river that was killing them. Until 1854, when a doctor in Soho did something that should have changed everything, and discovered that the government was not interested in being changed. Dr. John Snow had the evidence. He had the maps. He had the data. He stood before the Soho Board of Guardians and presented his case that cholera was spread through contaminated water, not through the air, as every medical authority of the era insisted. They listened. They removed the handle from Broad Street Pump. The outbreak ended, and then they put the handle back. Because the theory was inconvenient, because it implied that the water supply that the entire city depended on, was killing people. And that was a problem too large and too expensive to acknowledge. So, the summer of 1858 was unusually hot. London's average June temperature that year exceeded historical norms by several degrees. For the Thames, already carrying the biological waste of 2.5 million people, the heat did something that cold weather had partially masked. It accelerated the decomposition of the organic matter in the river. Decomposing organic matter produces gas, hydrogen sulfide, methane, compounds that, at sufficient concentration, are not merely unpleasant, but toxic. By the second week of June, the smell coming from the Thames had become detectable 2 miles from the riverbank. By the third week, Newspaper offices as far as Kensington were reporting that the smell had penetrated their buildings. By the fourth week, what Londoners had taken to calling the Great Stink had reached levels that contemporary accounts describe with a consistency and specificity that leaves little room for exaggeration. The Times reported that men who worked on the Thames, watermen, dock workers, bridge toll collectors, were routinely vomiting, not from nausea, from the actual physical reaction of hydrogen sulfide on the human mucous membrane. This was not metaphor, this was chemistry. The river had become, in practical terms, a source of toxic gas exposure for anyone who spent extended time near it, and the Palace of Westminster sat on its bank. The details of what happened inside Parliament in June and July of 1858 are preserved in the Hansard Parliamentary record. They make for remarkable reading. Members of Parliament who had spent years debating the Thames problem in the abstract, who had received reports and commissioned studies and deferred action through committees, were now sitting in chambers where the smell was entering through every window. The initial response was practical. Curtains. The curtains in the parliamentary chambers were soaked in lime chloride, a powerful disinfectant, and hung at every window in an attempt to filter the air before it reached the members inside. It did not work. Lime chloride at the concentration available in 1858 was insufficient to neutralize hydrogen sulfide at the levels coming off the Thames. The smell came through anyway. What happened next is recorded in the Times and in several private memoirs of members who were present. Members of Parliament, men who had sat through some of the most contentious debates of the Victorian era without leaving their seats, began getting up and walking out. Not all at once, one, then two, then groups, pressing handkerchiefs to their faces, moving towards the exits. The parliamentary session of June 1858 was in effect ended by a smell, and the members who fled, who retreated to their clubs and their country houses and their well-ventilated offices away from the river, did something that they had conspicuously failed to do for 30 years. They approved money. But here is the detail that makes this more than a story about a smell. Here is the detail that makes it a story about how power actually works. In the same week that Parliament fled its chambers, in the same 7 days that MPs were retreating to their country estates to breathe clean air, the courts and alleys of Southwark and Bermondsey and the East End were still full of people who had no country estates to retreat to. People who had been breathing this air for 30 years. People who had been dying from what was in the water for 30 years. And not one of them had been able to move Parliament to act. It took 11 days. 11 days from the first parliamentary exodus to the moment the Metropolis Local Management Amendment Act received royal assent, approving the construction of a new sewer system at a cost that in today's money would exceed £1 billion. 30 years of death had not done it. 11 days of smell had. Joseph William Bazalgette was 42 years old in 1858. He was the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, the body responsible for London's infrastructure. He had been working on plans for a new sewer system since 1853. 5 years of plans, 5 years of calculations, 5 years of proposals that had been reviewed, amended, rejected, and redrawn by committees that could not agree on who should pay for what, or where the tunnels should go, or whether the project was even necessary. Bazalgette had watched the debates. He had submitted his designs. He had waited. And now, in the summer of 1858, with Parliament fled and £11 million approved, and the political will that 5 years of dying had failed to produce, suddenly, urgently, unavoidably present. Bazalgette got what engineers almost never receive from governments: a deadline and freedom. What he produced in the months that followed is one of the greatest acts of civil engineering in recorded history. The design called for 82 miles of brick sewer tunnels running beneath the streets of London, intercepting the existing drains before they reached the Thames and redirecting their contents to outfall points east of the city, where the waste could be released into the tidal section of the river and carried out to sea. The tunnels would be large enough to walk through upright. They would be built from 318 million bricks. They would handle the combined waste of every household and business in London, and they would be built in an era before mechanical excavation, before modern concrete, before safety standards of any kind. On hand, by the hands of men working in conditions that their employers did not consider it their responsibility to regulate. But before construction began, Bazalgette faced a decision that every engineer who has read about it has subsequently used as the definitive example of how to think about infrastructure. His calculations told him what diameter the sewer pipes needed to be. His team agreed with the calculations. The numbers were checked. They were correct. Bazalgette looked at them, and then he doubled them. Not increased them by a safety margin, doubled them. When his engineers asked why, when they pointed out that the calculation was already correct, that the pipes as calculated would handle London's current waste output with room to spare, Bazalgette's response has been recorded in 2 separate accounts. He said he did not want to have to do this again. He could not know how large London would grow. He could not predict the population increases of the next century. He could not forecast the demands that an industrial city in continuous expansion would put on an underground system that, once buried, would be extraordinarily difficult and expensive to access and modify. What he knew was this: if he built it big enough now, if he resisted the pressure to calculate precisely and built beyond precision, the system would outlast every error he had made. It would outlast every assumption that turned out to be wrong. It would outlast him. And the decision he made in that moment, the decision to double a number that was already correct, is the reason that engineers walking Bazalgette's tunnels in 2024 find that they are still adequate, still moving, still working. 166 years later. But what those engineers have also found, what the inspections of Bazalgette's tunnels in the 21st century have consistently revealed, is something that the Victorian era never anticipated, something that changes the story of what Bazalgette actually built, and something that modern cities now desperately trying to upgrade their infrastructure have consistently failed to understand about what made his system work. Because Bazalgette did not just build bigger pipes, he built a different kind of system, one that operated on a principle that modern engineering engineers, working with computers and modeling software that Bazalgette could not have imagined, have spent the last 30 years trying to retro-engineer. A principle so simple that it sounds obvious when stated, and so consistently ignored that virtually every major infrastructure project of the 20th century failed to apply it. The principle that made an 1858 sewer system last longer than anything built since. And the reason it matters is not historical. The reason it matters is because, right now, beneath the cities you live in, there are pipes that were not built by Bazalgette. Pipes that were built by people who calculated precisely, who did not double the number, who built exactly what was needed, and who are now failing. The story of what Bazalgette understood and what modern engineering forgot is the second half of this archive. Construction began in 1859. 82 miles of brick tunnel running beneath London's streets that had never been disturbed since the Romans built their city above them. 318 million bricks. Mixed concrete that Bazalgette himself had specified, a formula more durable than anything used in contemporary British construction. And 11,000 workers. Men who worked by hand, by candlelight, in tunnels that flooded without warning and collapsed without notice, in an era where a worker killed underground was simply another name on a list that nobody in government was required to keep. The work took 6 years. By 1865, the main drainage system was complete. By 1875, the full network, including the northern and southern outfall sewers that carried London's waste to treatment stations east of the city, was operational. The cholera epidemics stopped, not gradually, completely. The 1866 epidemic, the last major cholera epidemic London would ever experience, was confined entirely to the East End district that had not yet been connected to Bazalgette's new system. The districts that were connected did not get cholera. The correlation was so clean, so absolute, so undeniable that even the medical establishment, which had resisted John Snow's waterborne theory for a decade, could no longer argue. The pipes proved what the data had always shown. Contaminated water killed, clean water saved. And Bazalgette's system, his doubled pipes, his Roman concrete, his 6 years of underground work had made London's water clean for the first time in 200 years. But here is what Bazalgette could not have anticipated. What he built did not just clean London's water, it built the template for every modern city on Earth. Within 20 years of the system's completion, engineers from Paris, Berlin, New York, Chicago, and Melbourne visited London to study Bazalgette's tunnels. His principles, his doubled dimensions, his concrete specification, his separation of wastewater from stormwater became the standard. Cities that had been building their own inadequate drainage systems abandoned their plans and rebuilt using Bazalgette's model. The modern sewer system, the infrastructure that allows dense urban populations to exist without epidemic disease, is his. Every city you have ever lived in, every city you have ever visited, built on the principle of a man who doubled a number that was already correct. Thames water engineers who inspect Bazalgette's original tunnels today report something that has no straightforward explanation. The Victorian brickwork, laid by hand, by candlelight in the 1860s, is in better condition than infrastructure built in the 1960s. The concrete Bazalgette specified, a mixture he developed by studying Roman construction methods, has proven more durable than 20th century alternatives that were developed with the benefit of 100 more years of material science. And the dimensions, the doubled dimensions that his engineers questioned in 1858. London's population today is approximately 9 million people. Bazalgette built for a city of 2.5 million. His pipes should have failed decades ago. They have not, because he doubled them, because he resisted the pressure to calculate precisely and built beyond precision. And because in doing so, he accidentally encoded into brick and mortar a principle that the infrastructure engineers of the 20th century, working with computers and models and materials he could not imagine, consistently failed to apply. Build for what you cannot predict, not for what you can calculate. The cities that ignored this principle, the ones that built precisely, that optimized for present need, that chose efficiency over redundancy, are now paying for it. In sinkholes, in failing pipes, in infrastructure crises that are projected to cost globally over $50 trillion to repair. The River Thames today is one of the cleanest urban rivers in the world. Salmon have returned. Species that disappeared from the river during the Victorian era have been documented in the Thames within the last 20 years. The water that Parliament once fled from is now swum in, fished in, and photographed by tourists who have no idea what it smelled like in June 1858. Beneath their feet, beneath the embankment that Bazalgette built also, above the tunnels he designed, running continuously since 1865, the sewer system is still working, moving, quietly, without acknowledgement. The way infrastructure always works when it works, invisibly, until it doesn't. Parliament ran from a smell in 1858 and accidentally solved a problem that 30 years of dying had failed to solve. A man named Bazalgette doubled a number and accidentally built the template for every city on Earth. The poor of Southwark and Bermondsey and the East End, the ones who had been dying for 30 years while the committees met, never had their deaths acknowledged as the cause of the solution. They were the reason. They were never the reason Parliament acted. The archive does not close on their names. It only asks what is currently being ignored, and whose smell has not yet reached the right chambers. Subscribe to Hist Discover. The next file is already open.